This is a flagrant violation of our Constitution. The mayor's words thundered through the packed chamber like a crack of lightning. Reporters jolted upright, cameras clicked in frantic bursts, and the crowd rippled with gasps that echoed against the marble walls. For a moment, the air itself seemed to stop moving, every eye locked on the podium, every ear straining to catch what would follow. Across from her, Donald Trump leaned back with calculated swagger, lips curling into a smirk. He spread his arms wide, as if absorbing the outrage and turning it into fuel. "Wrong," he barked, his voice dripping with contempt. "I'm restoring law and order. I'm protecting America. If you don't like it, too bad." The mayor's gaze did not waver. She gripped the lectern with steady resolve, her shoulders squared against the tidal wave of noise. The flashing lights from television crews lit her face in stark bursts, casting her as a lone figure holding the line while the weight of the presidency loomed over her like a storm. Reporters whispered to one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others scribbling furiously. Protesters outside pounded on the doors of the chamber, their muffled chants, "Constitution," "Freedom," seeping into the scene like a heartbeat. The confrontation was no longer confined to that hall. It was spilling into the streets, into living rooms across America, into the very soul of the nation. Trump leaned forward now, pointing a finger like a dagger. "Weak mayors, weak cities. That's why I had to step in. I'll use the military whenever I want. Nobody's going to stop me." His words dripped with arrogance, a direct dare to the Constitution itself. The mayor's reply was quiet but resolute, her voice slicing through the noise. "You may command power, but you do not command the people's spirit. And tonight, the nation will see where true strength lies." The room froze, tension humming like an electric wire ready to snap. The battle lines were drawn, swagger against conviction, arrogance against justice, fear against freedom. But this was only the opening salvo. What came next left the entire country on edge. The morning after the mayor's explosive words, Chicago awoke to the rumble of armored trucks rolling down its avenues. National Guard soldiers in camouflage lined the streets, rifles slung at their sides, eyes hidden behind dark visors. Overhead, helicopters circled low, their blades chopping the air with a menacing rhythm that reverberated through every neighborhood. The sound was unmistakable. This was not the hum of protection, but the drumbeat of occupation. Protesters gathered in defiance, their voices swelling into chants that refused to be silenced. "Whose streets are streets?" they roared, waving homemade signs, hoisting the Constitution itself high above their heads as if it were a shield. Police and guard units pushed back with batons and barricades, clashes erupting on corners once known for family barbecues and community parades. Smoke drifted above the skyline, not from celebration, but from tear gas canisters exploding in clouds that blurred the line between citizen and soldier. The narrator's voice pierced through the chaos. "This isn't just about Chicagoans, about America's soul. What happens here will decide whether freedom survives or fear takes its place." Every image streaming across television screens and phone feeds told the same story. An American city under siege by its own government. Parents pulled children inside, shopkeepers shuttered doors, and yet thousands of ordinary people refused to back down. They filled the streets with courage, holding candles, waving flags, chanting the words they believed could not be erased. "We the people." In Washington, Trump doubled down. From the White House podium, he called the crackdown a triumph of strength. He sneered at critics, branding the protests as lawless mobs, and declared that weak leaders must be overruled. His words, meant to project authority, instead carried the unmistakable stench of authoritarianism. Democracy itself felt as though it had been shoved against the wall. On Twitter, hashtags lit up like wildfire. Hashtag Stand With Chicago trended within hours. Videos of crying mothers shielding children from rubber bullets, circulating alongside images of veterans saluting protesters in the streets. At the same time, hashtag Trump Crackdown surged, drawing voices of condemnation from celebrities, lawmakers, and everyday Americans who felt they were witnessing a betrayal of the very values they were raised to believe in. The digital battlefield mirrored the one unfolding in Chicago's neighborhoods, a struggle between truth and spin, between people and power. Commentators warned that if this was allowed in Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Houston, Miami, the stakes were no longer confined to one city's streets, but stretched across the country like a question mark. Who owns America, the people, or the power? The mayor, though surrounded by armed opposition, refused to vanish from the stage. Each appearance she made became a rallying cry, her words echoing through microphones into millions of homes. This is not strength. This is fear disguised as power. And we will not bow to fear. The world was watching. And just when it seemed, the mayor was cornered. She fired back in a way no one saw coming. Donald Trump had always fashioned himself as the strong man, the lone protector standing between chaos and the American people. To his supporters, this image was intoxicating. To his critics, it was nothing less than dangerous theater. But in Chicago, under the glaring lights of a constitutional crisis, the mask slipped, revealing a figure obsessed not with freedom, but with control. From the earliest days of his presidency, Trump reveled in the language of domination. Law and order, he would thunder at rallies, his voice swelling with the promise of crackdowns. The crowds cheered as though strength itself was measured by the number of batons swung or the sheer force of military might. Yet beneath the bravado, contradictions festered. He proclaimed himself a defender of freedom. But his definition of freedom seemed to shrink. Every time a citizen dared raise their voice in dissent, flash back to his clashes with city leaders years earlier, mayors who demanded resources without strings attached, governors who pleaded for federal aid while rejecting his conditions. Trump's answer was always the same: public shaming, fiery tweets, and ultimatums delivered not as negotiations, but as decrees. He framed critics as weak, cowards, disgraces to their states. To him, compromise was not democracy, but surrender. And in his worldview, surrender was the gravest sin. The contradictions grew sharper in moments of crisis. During protests for racial justice, spoke of defending liberty while deploying troops against those who marched with signs quoting the Constitution. He cloaked his decisions in patriotic language, but every image that emerged, soldiers facing unarmed citizens, helicopters scattering peaceful assemblies, betrayed the hollow truth. The freedom he claimed to protect was a freedom reserved only for those who applauded him. For everyone else, freedom was negotiable. Trump's obsession with control went beyond policy. It was personal. Every critic, no matter how small, became an enemy to crush. Every city that resisted his commands became a battlefield, and in his mind, Chicago was not a city of families and communities. It was a symbol, a stage on which he could prove his dominance. As helicopters roared over Chicago's streets, one could almost hear echoes of his past boasts. "I alone can fix it," he had declared during his campaign, a phrase that had morphed from a slogan into an obsession. Fixing in his lexicon meant bending the nation to his will. Now in his mind, the mayor of Chicago was not a public servant protecting her citizens, but an obstacle to be humiliated, a foil to be crushed on live television. The arrogance was breathtaking. Surrounded by aides nodding along, he dismissed warnings from constitutional scholars, brushed aside protests from civil rights leaders, scoffed at the pleas of ordinary families caught in the crossfire. To him, dissent was weakness. Weakness was failure, and failure was unforgivable. He believed himself untouchable, buoyed by power, fueled by cameras, convinced that history itself would bend to his narrative, and yet the cracks were visible. Social media pulsed with outrage. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle whispered concerns, and even some in his own circle began to question how far he would go. But Trump could not see it. Arrogance had clouded his vision, and control had become his creed. As he strutted before cameras, painting himself as the lone guardian of American greatness, the contradiction was glaring. The man who claimed to defend freedom was the very one silencing it. The man who boasted of protecting the Constitution was testing its limits with every decree. Audiences watching from across the nation felt the tension in their bones, the arrogance, the smirks, the dismissive waves of his hand, it was enough to make frustration boil over into rage. Viewers craved a reckoning, a moment when his swagger would finally collide with the weight of justice. And that moment was closer than anyone realized, because across the battlefield of politics, a very different figure was rising. Long before she stood at the podium challenging a president's show of force, Chicago's mayor was known simply as the daughter of immigrants who came to this country with little more than hope stitched into their pockets. Her parents arrived with no guarantees, no powerful connections, and no certainty that America would embrace them. What they carried instead was a belief that this country, despite its flaws, could offer dignity and opportunity to anyone willing to fight for it. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the South Side, where cracked sidewalks and aging street lamps bore witness to resilience as much as hardship. Her mother worked double shifts in a garment factory, her hands worn from years at the sewing machine. Her father labored as a taxi driver, navigating long nights to put food on the table. From them, she learned two lessons that would shape her destiny: never confuse silence with weakness, and never mistake arrogance for strength. Asterisk, as a child, she translated for neighbors navigating City Hall, watching how the system too often ignored or dismissed those with accents and brown skin. In those moments, she discovered the first spark of purpose. By the time she entered high school, she wasn't just a student, she was an organizer, rallying classmates to demand better textbooks, safer streets, and fair treatment. Where others saw obstacles, she saw battles worth fighting. College came with sacrifice. She worked nights as a waitress to afford tuition, balancing textbooks with trays of steaming plates. But rather than breaking her, the struggle sharpened her resolve. She pursued law not for prestige, but because she believed the Constitution was not a distant parchment but a living promise, one that belonged to every family like hers. Her career began in community activism, who preyed on immigrant families, fought city contracts that funneled resources into corrupt hands, and stood alongside mothers who had lost children to gun violence. Each victory was small, hard-won, and often unseen by the wider world, but in neighborhoods across Chicago, her name became a synonym for courage. The path to leadership was never smooth. She faced opponents who tried to smear her as too inexperienced, too radical, even too foreign. Some mocked her accent when she spoke Spanish with families at community meetings. Others whispered that someone from her background could never stand toe-to-toe with the city's entrenched political machine, but she refused to retreat. Every insult became fuel. Every barrier became proof that change was necessary. When she finally won the mayor's office, it wasn't the victory of a politician, it was the triumph of a movement. Crowds filled the city square, waving flags not just of the United States, but of the nations her supporters had once called home. For them, her election was living proof that the American story was still being written, and that their children's names could one day be etched into its pages. As mayor, she refused the easy path of compromise with corruption. She slashed bloated contracts, redirected funds into schools and clinics, and held police accountable in ways that infuriated entrenched powers. There were nights when threats arrived at her door, when her own safety seemed fragile, but she never flinched. Her loyalty was not to comfort, but to the people who had placed their trust in her above all. She carried the Constitution as a sacred trust. She quoted it not as a weapon, but as a covenant. "We the people," she would often say, was not abstract, it was the mothers in Little Village, shopkeepers in Bronzeville, the young activists marching in Grant Park. To her, defending that covenant was more than duty. It was the essence of her identity. And that was why Trump's arrogance cut so deeply. When he deployed soldiers into her city, when he sneered at her as weak for defending her citizens, he wasn't just challenging her authority, he was desecrating the very promise her parents had believed in when they first set foot on American soil. Unlike others who sparred with Trump and folded, she carried scars that made her unshakable. She had known hunger, humiliation, and the sting of being dismissed. She had faced down corruption that seemed unbeatable, only to expose its rot to the light. She understood what it meant to be underestimated, and she understood how to turn that underestimation into strength. In her, America saw not just a mayor, but a mirror a leader forged by struggle. Lifted by community and grounded in values that could not be bought or bullied. She embodied dignity in the face of insult, steadiness in the face of chaos, and courage in the face of overwhelming force. And when the moment came, she was ready to deliver a counterpunch America would never forget. The chamber was electric. Every seat filled, every lens locked on the unfolding spectacle. Reporters scribbled furiously, camera shutters clicked in staccato bursts, and the air itself seemed heavy with anticipation. On one side stood Donald Trump, shoulders squared, lips curled into a smirk as he leaned into the microphone. On the other stood the mayor of Chicago, steady hands clasped calmly on the podium, her presence radiating control even as the storm swirled. Trump struck first, his voice booming with mockery. Weak leaders, he sneered, invite chaos. And Chicago? Well, it's the poster child for failure. Maybe your city should thank me for finally bringing real law and order. He punctuated his jab with a dismissive wave, drawing laughter from a few loyalists in the room. The mayor didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked on him, unblinking. When she spoke, her voice was measured, each word crisp enough to slice through the noise. What you call law and order, Mr. President, the people here call occupation. What you dismiss as weakness, we know is democracy. And no amount of swagger will erase that truth. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Cameras zoomed in, catching the contrast between Trump's flushed face and the mayor's composed demeanor. For the first time, the balance of energy seemed to shift. Trump straightened, his smirk faltering just slightly before returning with forced bravado. He leaned forward, voice dripping with sarcasm. Spare us the speeches. You're in over your head. Your so-called leadership is why Chicago is burning. His words hung like a challenge, sharp and taunting. The mayor tilted her head, almost pitying. Chicago is not burning, she replied calmly. Chicago is alive. It is resilient. And it will not be bullied into submission, not by fear, not by force, and certainly not by you. A gasp swept across the room. Reporters glanced at one another, recognizing the gravity of her defiance. Trump's jaw tightened. He slammed a hand on the podium, raising his voice louder, angrier. You don't get it. Without strength, this country collapses. And you, he jabbed a finger toward her, are too soft to protect it. But instead of rattling her, the attack seemed to steel her resolve. She stepped closer to the microphone, her voice unwavering. Strength without justice is tyranny. And America does not bow to tyrants. The chamber exploded with sound. Gasps, shouts, claps. The audience was split between outrage and admiration. The clash had become more than words. It was a battle over the soul of the nation. Playing out under the blinding lights of the cameras, Trump's face reddened further. He spoke over her, his words spilling in a torrent. You're a disgrace, a mayor who can't control her own streets lecturing me about the Constitution. Pathetic. His voice cracked, the edge of desperation seeping through the bombast. But the mayor never raised her tone. Her calmness only sharpened the contrast, every steady phrase hitting harder than his volume. She let him finish, then delivered her retort. With surgical precision, what's pathetic is a president who confuses control with leadership and intimidation with respect. Chicago deserves better. America deserves better. The room froze. Even the cameras seemed to pause, lenses unblinking. As the weight of her words settled, Trump shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the crowd as if searching for reassurance that wasn't there. Reporters whispered. Social media feeds lit up in real time. Hashtags exploding. Hashtag stand with the mayor. Hashtag clash in Chicago. Hashtag truth. V's power. Viewers at home leaned forward, sensing history in the making. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because the clash, as intense as it was, hadn't reached its peak. Every breath in the room carried the same unspoken anticipation. Something bigger was coming. The tension was a taut wire, ready to snap. The room was bracing itself because everyone knew this clash was about to explode. The chamber had grown so tense you could almost hear the collective heartbeat. Cameras leaned in, reporters froze mid-scribble, and every eye turned to the mayor. She stood still for a long moment, letting Trump's last insult hang in the air like smoke. Silence stretched, calculated, deliberate. Then, with a calm steadiness, "That cut sharper than any shout," she began. "Mr. President," she said, her voice carrying the gravity of both history and heartbreak. "You speak of strength as though it were measured in soldiers, in weapons, in how loudly you can silence dissent. But that is not America's strength. Our strength is in our people, in our Constitution, in the idea that power comes from the governed, not from fear." Her words landed like thunder in a hushed storm. Reporters leaned closer. Even Trump, for a moment, seemed caught off guard. His lips pursed as if preparing to interrupt, but he didn't. "Not yet," she continued, her voice unwavering. "I am the daughter of immigrants. My parents came here with nothing but faith in this country's promise that if they worked hard, obeyed the law, and believed in liberty, their children could grow up free. That is America, not tanks rolling down city streets, not helicopters circling peaceful protesters, and certainly not the silencing of voices demanding justice." The audience stirred. Some gasped, others nodded, and a ripple of applause swelled before being quickly hushed by the chamber staff. The mayor let it hang, just long enough to build momentum before pressing forward. "You claim to defend the Constitution," she said, locking eyes with Trump. "Yet you treat it like a prop to wave, not a covenant to honor. The First Amendment guarantees the right of the people to assemble, to speak, to challenge their leaders. That includes you, especially you." Trump shifted, gripping the edge of his podium tighter. His trademark smirk faltered for the briefest second. Cameras caught it, the world watching as his swagger began to waver. The mayor paused deliberately, letting the silence stretch again. And then, in words sharp as steel, she declared, "Strength is not sending troops against unarmed citizens. Strength is having the courage to face their voices without fear." The chamber erupted. Applause burst from the audience, despite attempts to maintain order. The sound ricocheted through the hall like a wave crashing against stone. Trump tried to interject, his voice rising. "Fake news. Weakness. Total weakness." But his protests were drowned out by the roar. The mayor didn't raise her voice. She simply waited, her composure towering over the chaos. When the applause finally subsided, she spoke again, quieter now but with words that sliced deeper because of it. "You call me weak? Let me tell you what weakness is. Weakness is hiding behind soldiers when citizens demand answers. Weakness is mocking communities instead of serving them. Weakness is confusing obedience with respect." In weakness, she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's being so terrified of the people's power that you try to silence it." The chamber froze. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in on Trump, his jaw tight, his hands clenched, his face reddening as beads of sweat began to gather on his forehead. The image was undeniable. The once commanding figure looked cornered, rattled, diminished. The mayor, meanwhile, radiated composure. Her voice grew stronger, infused now with inspiration. "Chicago is not yours to occupy. Its people are not pawns in your games of power. And America will not bow to a leader who forgets that the Constitution is not optionally, is binding. It is sacred, and it belongs to all of us." Thunderous applause broke out again, this time impossible to contain. Reporters scrambled to tweet. Live stream feeds lit up with captions. "Mayor destroys Trump. Constitutional smackdown goes viral. Moment of truth in Chicago." Trump tried again to regain control, waving his hands, raising his voice. But every word he uttered felt smaller, more desperate. Lies. All lies. Nobody believes this nonsense. His face twisted with frustration as the mayor simply stood, in dignified silence, letting his unraveling speak for itself. And then she delivered the final blow. "Weak leaders divide. Strong leaders serve. And history will not remember how loud you shouted, Mr. President. It will remember who stood up for justice when it mattered most." The chamber detonated. Cheers, claps, chants, justice rolled through the hall like an earthquake. Trump's voice was drowned entirely now, his words reduced to an inaudible flailing beneath the roar of the people. On social media, the clip was already viral. Within minutes, hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Mayor vs. Trump. Hashtag constitutional courage. Hashtag mic drop moment. Memes flooded the internet, Trump's flustered face juxtaposed against the mayor's calm stare, captioned with lines like "Strength is having courage, not soldiers." It was more than a debate moment. It was a shift. A pivot in perception. The arrogance that had defined Trump's presence was collapsing in real time, while the mayor's dignity was rising like a beacon. The visual contrast was undeniable. Power rooted in fear unraveling before power rooted in principle. Reporters whispered it among themselves, pundits tweeted it instantly. And viewers at home felt it deep in their chest. This wasn't just a takedown. It was history. But as powerful as the moment was, it was only the beginning. Because the ripple. The effect of this takedown wouldn't stop in that room. It was about to sweep the nation. A flagrant violation of our Constitution. Those words, thundered by Chicago's mayor at the height of the confrontation, became more than a headline. They became a defining theme, a rallying cry for every American who refuses to let arrogance trample liberty or fear smother justice. We have witnessed how arrogance tries to disguise itself as strength, how force attempts to masquerade as authority. And yet in the end, it was dignity that stood tall. It was courage, not cruelty, that carried the day. This is the story that matters, that when leaders betray the promise of America, ordinary people and the voices of truth rise to remind us who we really are. Tonight, we saw it in Chicago. Tomorrow, it could be anywhere. And that's why these stories cannot fade into silence. If this moment moved you, if you believe the Constitution belongs to the people, not to power, then join us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next battle in America's unfolding drama. Share this video with friends, family, and your community, because these stories gain strength only when they spread. And most of all, be part of this movement, a movement that refuses to surrender to fear, that insists on justice, and that still believes in the American promise. Because the truth is simple. No single leader defines us. We define ourselves. Every act of dignity, every stand for justice, every refusal to bow to arrogance is proof that America's spirit lives on. Together, we will keep America's promise alive.